Welcome to our artwork NASCAD alumni talks. Our NASCAD community is a global one, and I'm sure many of us are joining from lots of different places today, but our talk itself and our university is being hosted in Chibuktuk and Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. We are honored to work, gather, and make artwork here. My name is Molly Cronin. I am a NASCAD alumna myself, BA 2015, and I am joined today, much to my thrill, with two other cartoonists, two other comic makers to talk with me today. Susan MacLeod, BFA 1994, and Rebecca Roher, BFA 2010. So Susan and Rebecca, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And we're going to be talking about thanks. And I think there'll be a little lag, Susan, I think, because like your bandwidth's a bit slow. So if I interrupt you, I'm very sorry, and I'll pull back if that ever happens, where there's that little bit of a lag between our timing, I think. But we'll make it work. We've got the technology and the gumption, so I'm not worried. But to get us started, we're going to be talking about graphic memoir work and elder care specifically. But I'd love if we could just kind of chat a little bit at the beginning, and you could both tell us a bit about yourselves and your work. Maybe Susan, we can get started with you. Can you tell us about your work and yourself and your practice?
Yeah, sure. So I graduated with a degree in painting and desktop publishing. Like it was very, very early days of desktop publishing, and but I always wanted to draw. At that time, NASCAD didn't really have a robust drawing program. It was mostly conceptual. So when my mother really began to decline, and I found it such an overwhelming experience, I wanted to draw about it, and almost as a way of healing, and also to express that this is such a unseen experience. And so I just wondered, maybe I can do a comic about that. I just kind of asked myself that, and then so I did, and no one stopped me. And so it ended up being a book that was published by Conundrum in October 2021, called Dying for Attention, a graphic memoir of nursing home care. So I just did it one foot in front of the other, bit by bit by bit.
That's wonderful. Rebecca, what about you? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice?
Yeah, I'm a cartoonist based in Toronto, but I lived in Nova Scotia for 8 years and always returned back here. When I was an NASCAD student, I was in mostly drawing and painting. I did do some film and other things, but a lot of my work was very narrative based. There was always so many stories packed in that I would be explaining the whole story to my my class, and then I sort of ended up in illustration and wanted to do children's book illustration, because I love the power of sort of forming children's minds, and those images of children's books that I grew up with was so impactful for me. And then as it kind of happened, I was invited to run some narrative art workshops for a library in Bridgewater, and I was like, oh, kids like comics, I'll learn how to make comics and graphic novels. And I started reading. I got a lot of graphic novels that I borrowed from friends, and I just was so blown away by the genius of these creators. And they were using this language that I wanted to learn, this narrative visual storytelling language. And so I enrolled at Center for Cartoon Studies to learn more about making comics and the publishing industry. And I realized I had a lot of stories that were more adult themed that I wanted to tell. And I sort of ended up, in things lead to one thing leads to another. And I did this book, Bird in a Cage, about my grandmother's decline into dementia, and our sort of family history and my memories of her and her life. So yeah, but I also really like to collaborate with professionals in their own fields and use the comics language and visual storytelling and the kind of emotional impact that it can have to further communicate their research and expertise out into the world to kind of make the world a better place. Definitely have sort of a humanitarian aspect to my work. And so right now, I'm kind of collaborating a little with a social worker who is working with children who are experiencing grief and doing some artwork in collaboration with her, and another fellow who's an academic and has a lot of research into computer technology, and so helping illustrate his book. And I'm also working on my own graphic novel, which is 100-Year-Old Wisdom, which is based on interviews with near 100-year-olds, kind of continuing on the theme of the elderly experience and kind of promoting empathy and kind of capturing the wisdom of people who we are on the verge of losing or have already lost. So
I love hearing how people who work in comics kind of find themselves there, because it's not always like a simple trajectory. Like, although all three of us went to NASCAD, we maybe weren't studying comics there, but I love how we've all come to that place. And Susan, you have a background not only in fine arts, but also you've pursued a nonfiction writing MFA. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about those different schooling and education pursuits you underwent in the process of like this comics journey, as both a writer and a visual artist.
So, well, first of all, I'm very fortunate because I have money. I have a pension, so I can spend money on education, and I know that's not everyone's experience. So when I sat on my deck that day and I was just beginning the script, I really had no idea what I was doing in terms of writing about this experience, this nursing home experience with my mother, but I knew I had to start somewhere. And I showed that script to a few people who weren't artists, and it was written, but who weren't creators. They were in the nursing home field, and they didn't like it at all. But undeterred, I think that's part of 100-year-old wisdom, is that you get a certain age and you think, I don't care, I'm just gonna go for it anyway. And so I ran into someone who was doing that Masters of Fine Arts program at King's in creative nonfiction. And it seemed like that was just what I needed, because I didn't know how to write a book So I went to speak to Stephen Kimber, and they were willing to take me on as their first graphic memoir. And it was and then I'm very thankful they hired Rebecca as my graphic mentor. I had a narrative mentor, and Rebecca was my graphic mentor, because I really didn't have a clue. But it was just I was so grateful that they did that for me. And it was in that program that I understood how you write a memoir, that every story is, of course, more than one story, how you build a narrative arc, how you integrate research, because in a creative non-fiction program, there's a lot of research. So how you integrate real world evidence into your personal story, all that came from that fine arts program. And yeah, and when I came out of there, I had a 28-page book proposal, which they teach you how to do, and 2 finished chapters, thanks to Rebecca. And then I was able to sell the book to a publisher within a year.
No, it's so fascinating to think about how there is the writing practice that needs to be maintained as a cartoonist, and also the visual art. So I didn't realize, Rebecca, that you were working with Susan on that project. That's such a fun
Yeah,
connection.
that was a really wonderful experience to be part of Susan's project and just have the pages like come into me. Like, you know, she was doing the hard work, but I was kind of helping tweak it and, you know, using the knowledge I had learned from Center for Cartoon Studies and sort of making comics myself and helping her with that. And it's so amazing as cartoonists to be able to be both writers and fine artists, and to be able to live in both of those worlds is so wonderful, and pushing the limits of both of those things. So it's really amazing that you pioneered that in that program, Susan.
Yeah, thank you. I think they have another one coming in. If I understood, I ran into Harry the other day and he said there was more coming. So that's good.
Cool.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, that is great. You're right. There are no clear paths to, there are many different paths to getting a graphic novel into the world. And also, of course, many graphic visual narratives are wordless as well. So that's another storytelling channel, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Rebecca, I'd love to chat with you a bit also about your practice as a comics educator, because I know you were teaching at NASCAD. And I'm curious to talk about coming from a place like CCS, where there's like or any master's program where there's like an intense focus on that practice, then coming to a school like NASCAD that's so multidisciplinary. And what's it like to teach comics in that environment?
It's really wonderful to be working with students who are already so trained and talented and excited about this medium, and have already a lot of skills that in terms of like fine art skills, much of the time, not necessarily everyone is coming from a drawing background, but they already just have so much that they're bringing to it. And I learned at Center for Cartoon Studies some really great pedagogy, and especially being exposed to particularly Linda Berry's pedagogy. And her approach is really, you don't need, and even at Center for Cartoon Studies, you don't need to be an artist to draw comics. And she teaches people from all walks of life, even particularly engineers and people who are really not in the arts at all, and not even writers. And she really finds these ways of tapping into creativity and playfulness and memory and exploration. And that's a lot of what I bring to my students. Usually, people might have more of a fine art background and less so of the writing side. And so that's kind of where we focus on building skills. But it's so rewarding as a teacher to be able to guide people who bring so much already, and just, level up their skills to and strengthen the skills where they need it. But yeah, it's it really, you don't have to be an amazing artist to be a cartoonist. You just have to sort of be willing to try and make marks and do your best. I love that comics are a medium that can be so simple and so untrained, but still be so powerful.
Yeah, I agree. And I wonder if even sometimes there has to be a kind of untraining, like when you have a certain level of fine drawing skills, if you have to kind of adjust the way you render, or like the way you draw faces, for example, because comics have their own visual language. And I imagine there might be some adjustment that goes on there.
When I started at the Center for Cartoon Studies, I was never drawing panel borders. That felt really foreign to me and rigid. And then I think, I kind of like, I learned this thing, and then I was like, I don't think that is really for me necessarily, or sometimes, but it is a funny thing where you almost don't want to learn too much and and kind of take on other people's approaches and styles. I guess it's important to kind of be aware of when you're doing that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's great. I'm thrilled that there's been some comics classes at NASCAD. That's so exciting.
Yeah. And very much thanks to Matthew Reichertz. He uses comics in his work, and was excited to see that I had, trained to the point where I could be a teacher, and really helped facilitate me getting into this position. And I'm so glad, because it obviously was really missing. My classes always have a wait list, and my students are saying how excited they are to see comics being offered. And I'm so happy to be one of the people to bring that in.
No, that's great. And Susan was just asking about Matthew in the chat. I just popped him in. Well, listen, maybe now is a good time to chat a bit more in depth about the books you've both put out. Maybe Susan, we could start with you. And I'd love to talk a bit. You talked a bit about how, as your mother was aging, and you started your comic practice around then. But I'd love if you could tell us a bit more about how Dying for Attention came about, and navigating that relationship with your family while creating it.
Yeah, okay. So just to add first about Linda Barry, the thing, she always advises people when they're doubting their artwork to say, I don't know. And that certainly was one of my mantras going through it. I think this is very bad, but I don't really know. So I'll just keep going. And that's really important. And cartooning is very forgiving. And I belong to an association called Graphic Medicine, which is the intersection of healthcare discourse and the comic arts. And there's a conference coming up in Toronto in July 13th to the 17th, or 15th or something. And that's a great book, because almost every topic in deals with healthcare, that you can think of, unless it's really fantasy oriented. And they have a very broad definition about what you can consider healthcare. And at one conference I went to, they talked about the democracy of comics, that really takes a long time, and it's not easy, but it's very democratic. And anyone can do it. And in terms of the book, I was drawing nursing home residents as a way to kind of cope with being in a nursing home, because it was such a foreign environment and unknown, and one I dreaded, and one I didn't really want to be in. So I started kind of Humans of St. Vincent's. My mother wasn't in St. Vincent's here in Halifax, but I was a volunteer there. So I was on the board, so they trusted me, and they allowed me to go around and just simply sketch the residents. And that helped me a lot. As well in my mother's nursing home, where I was sketching my mother and her interactions with people, it helped me. It was a way for me to navigate that space if I was drawing it. And then as things get worse, as they almost always can, only can in a nursing home, that's when I began to think maybe there's a story here that I can tell. And so there are 3 threads in my book. I was the government spokesperson for continuing care. And so I realized the huge gap between the messages we were given, our perspectives, and the perspectives of the family and the user. The family, and the resident. And the second one, so there was government perspectives. There was also my brother and I were falling out over the care of my mother. And apparently that's not uncommon, that old animosities resurface when parents decline and die. And so that is another thread. And then the sorry state of nursing home care in general was the third thread. And so those were the 3 stories that I wove together with the help of the MFA program. But of course, there are lots of books and workshops out there about creating narrative work arcs and weaving stories together. Anyway, that's where they really helped me there. And we talked a lot about in that program, because a lot of people were writing memoirs about how you deal with family, my mother died before the book was finished, so you don't have to worry about anyone who's dead, it turns out. But my brother is very much alive, and so I did try to have a conversation about the book, and that there would be some parts of the book that would make him feel uncomfortable when we were in conflict. But some legal advice we got is that a book is meant to be read from beginning to end. So you can't just select a bad part of the book and sue the author for libel. And in my book, there was some kind of resolution at the end, or some kind of coming to terms, or a better perspective about my brother. And so anyway, so that I had the book reviewed by a lawyer before it went to press, and that's, it was good the way I had resolved it. My brother was just indifferent, and I'm sure he hasn't even read the book to this day, because our relationship is so mistrustful and distant. And will never be resolved, I don't think, because he lives far away in so many levels.
No, it's very complicated to navigate. I mean, both with living and with deceased relatives and these kinds of things. And how do you balance your interpretations with theirs? And it's, yeah, very complex to be an autobiographical writer of any kind, but comics as well, because there's the visual as well, the portraiture, excuse me, the portraiture of each person. And yeah, very tricky to navigate, but I think you did a very graceful job, Susan.
And I stole that opening line from Rebecca, where these are my recollections, but they might not be the recollections of others.
Yes.
I showed that to Kim Pitaway, and she thought, "Oh my God, that's so great! We should be using this in all our books."
Yeah, I just felt like I had to say that or something. But I also love that the comics are so clearly from the artist's hand. Like the hand is so evidently there in the style and the limitations, and it kind of goes without saying in a way, like as opposed to maybe a documentary film or a novel or something. There's something so it's clearly drawn from their memory and limitations of how well they can draw. But then so I think that there's something really kind of honestly subjective about comics that feels genuine and I don't know, like more truthful in its lack of complete authentic truth or something, whatever that means. But I, especially since I was doing a book about my family, I thought I really felt like I need to be clear that this was my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, even the style of drawing in comics is one where you kind of reduce a lot of visual information and bring to the forefront things that are maybe more true or more obvious. Like you're always kind of minimizing and maximizing details, and even like, at a nerdy comic theory level, that there is like a distancing from reality in comics. Like there's images and words on the same page. There's violence or things that happen in comics, and because they're in a cartoon form, we like understand that it's not real. So maybe that allows us a little grace as authors. Maybe people will extend that grace to us, But Rebecca, I'd love to hear you talk a bit about your book as well, about Bird in a Cage.
Yeah, so Bird in a Cage, my grandma had this accident in I think it was 2001, and she was 82 years old when she was hit by a car, and this led to early onset dementia. And it was such a tragedy, particularly because she had been caring for my aunt, who was struggled a lot with I think she was bipolar. I think she was diagnosed in a lot of ways, but she definitely had sort of depressive episodes, and my grandma was her kind of caregiver up until Sheila took her own life, and this is in the book as well. And so it was particularly tragic because Sheila had passed away, and finally my grandma was sort of had freedom to live her life, and kind of be her own woman at that point when she was 82. And then all of a sudden she has this brain injury, and all of that is taken away from her. So it was just this like very big tragedy to me that was so sad. And then also the kind of like funny moments of dementia and the weird, bizarre, dark humor of it, where she would, mistake a bottle of vodka for water and put it on the table for dinner, or kind of put sticks into the sink instead of by the fireplace. Like there were these like funny parts about it. And so the narrative started kind of braiding itself in my mind, and I just had so many like visuals that I wanted to put down and piece this thing together. And then when I was in comic book school at Center for Cartoon Studies, we had to do this like in our second year. So we had learned all of these cartooning skills the first year, and then the second year, the first project you do is do a 16-page comic about anything you want to do at all. And so my grandma at that point was sort of dying, and she had fallen and she broke her hip and she wasn't eating. So the story was like so pertinent, and it just came out of me, this like 20-page comic about her going to the cottage for the last time, and sort of being able to remember the music without knowing who any of us were or where she was. The power of the music that she had been singing with our family for generations was brought her back to us. And and then she was dying that year, so I went back to visit a lot, and started researching about her life and building up the story into more of a graphic novel length, which was, I guess I was sort of planning that year. And then that comic, the first 20-page comic I did, got some attention on the Nib, and at Expozine it won the best comic for English language at Expozine. And so Andy at Conundrum, on sort of Joel Ullman's recommendation, got in touch with me to see if I wanted to make it into a full-length book, and I had already been thinking about that, so we worked together on it. And so I finished it in the year following my graduating Center for Cartoon Studies, and put it out in 2017. And my family was mostly extremely supportive. My mom was very much like, she's an artist, so she really understands, like, you're an artist, you have to, don't think about what other people think, you just have to do your vision, and we trust you to be sensitive, but do what you have to do. It was a little bit trickier with my other aunt, my surviving aunt, who was concerned about the way I portrayed my aunt who had passed away, and the issue of sort of reducing someone's life down to the tragedy of their life. And I took some of her notes and incorporated them, and it definitely raised some difficult questions of sort of, am I capitalizing on someone else's tragedy? And but the reality is, like, no one's making money off of this book. Like, it actually really is just a labor of love, and feels to me like a gift to my family and myself and the generations later that will read it and know about this woman who otherwise her life would kind of disappear and into time. So I had to process that and resolve that with myself, and she's really supportive of the book, and ultimately sort of had to ask those questions, but also knows that my heart was in the right place or whatever. But it was hard to deal with those sensitive issues for sure. And these are big questions because these are people I have relationships with now. And you can it just goes to show how powerful this storytelling is and the way we tell stories, what we include, what we don't, and the lasting effects of these stories. And comics are powerful. People get really upset about them. I did another comic about my cousin Dave, who died of a drug overdose, and another aunt on my other side was pretty upset about how I portrayed him, and I felt like I did a good job, and I think he would have appreciated it. And that's kind of like a choice that I had to make, to whether or not it was worth it. But I think we're gonna be okay and repair that. But it definitely goes to show how powerful these things can be, and you do have to kind of weigh the urgency of the work as opposed versus the keeping everybody happy, and whether you want to compromise the artwork for the other people's views and feelings about it. So it's a tricky business, but I think that it's also important to tell these stories, and I think that it makes people feel less alone, and it sheds light onto things that are otherwise kind of hidden and not talked about. So that's what
absolutely.
I would say.
And it's great to hear that for the most part there's been a lot of support from your family in creating these stories. And you're right, it is a very powerful medium, comics, right? It's very, because it's so approachable, but it also is very intimate. So it's wonderful to hear that you had that kind of bolstering from your intimate
yes, I'm so lucky that I have a supportive family, and and that and community. For sure.
Well, my next question for both of you is thinking about the broader community reading your books, especially in relation to elder care. What are the particular things you hope that readers take away from your books? Maybe Susan, we could start with you.
Well, I wrote it because nursing home care is invisible, and aging is almost invisible, and certainly the level of aging that you find in nursing home cares is not part of our culture. It's not seen, it seems to me, unseen. And so I was so shocked by the experience that I did want to show it. It's almost for a person like me, because it felt so like I was the only one going through this. And I knew I surely couldn't be, but it just wasn't anywhere out there. So, or at least that I could find. So I was writing it for people like me, and that has been very gratifying, because if you go to my website and you look under the book part, there's a section called Reader's Response, and I got a lot of letters from people like me who were most grateful to have their experience shown, and to have to know it wasn't their fault, and they weren't the only one going through this, and to perhaps understand some of the systemic issues that I understood, having worked in government. So that was really validating for me. And also, I just came back from the Fry Festival in Moncton, where I believe it's a new program they have called Writers in Community, where in addition to their literary programming, of course, they have they had 2 weeks prior. They had an additional program just last week called Writers in Community, where they're looking at books that are trying to make a difference. So I think I was the first one to be invited, and they for that afternoon they invited nursing home administrators, continuing care workers, family members, politicians, and they paired me up with a researcher from Mount Allison University who is doing a cross posting in business and gender studies. And so she had already been looking at job design for caregivers, and she was very, very interested from a research point of view about caregiving in this particular economy. And and also Pay Equity New Brunswick, which is an organization that seeks to bring pay levels for care workers up to the proper level that they should be at for the skill and demands of that work. So they were all in the room, and that was so much fun. And as the Fry Festival coordinator told me afterwards, she said, we haven't had an audience so present as they were for this talk, because we were all exploring the same underseen, undervalued experience. So I was, that's excellent for me. That's okay. I've done it.
You really do a good job of drawing attention to the kind of like gendered labor around elder care, both in like the family structure, that it's so much often the women in the family, the daughters and the granddaughters, that take on a lot of the kind of like family care, and then also how gendered the healthcare system is and who's doing what jobs. But yeah, you really capture that well in the book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, that was horrifying.
Yeah. But it's great that you were able, yeah, to connect with these other people, because it's such a vulnerable time of life, and it's a place that we all feel so much uncertainty. So it sounds great that the book is maybe kind of like a bit of guidance, or at least I'm going through this too for other people reading it, you know?
Yeah, I'm so grateful that New Brunswick found me. I haven't got much traction in Nova Scotia, and I think that's because I was too hard on the Nova Scotia system. I've tried, but anyway, but that's okay.
Yeah, that must have been a tricky part of the collaboration, was also the kind of how the healthcare system itself responded to it, and who you were talking to, and the general reception by the kind of workers. But and I think you do a good job of showing like how fraught and overworked those workers are too. But it's a very complicated, systemic, larger issue on top of these very vulnerable personal ones when it comes to elder care, right?
Right,
Yeah.
and it starts with their economy, which makes no room. Like, you can't do supply and demand with caregiving.
Yeah.
The demand doesn't go away. So
There's a lot of demand. Yeah.
you can't just cut off the supply, which is, of course, what governments do.
Yeah, exactly. Rebecca, what about you? What was it that you were hoping readers would take away? What were you hoping was like the didactic potential of Bird in a Cage?
I think that I was hoping to kind of make the humanity of an elderly woman evident, sort of like shed light onto the inner life of an elderly woman who kind of who in dementia is just like clutching to her purse and like hitting people when she's scared and not being able to be verbal. And it's so hard to connect with that person's humanity and their inner life and who they really are, all the history behind that person. And I think I was trying to sort of promote empathy for that experience. And also this work has been kind of embraced by the the graphic medicine community, and a few times I've gotten a few people have reached out to me from sort of medical schools to bring me in to talk to doctors in training who are doing palliative care or dealing with the elderly, and this book has helped them tune into the empathy aspect and kind of provide better bedside manner and patient care. So that's been really rewarding. And I've heard, sometimes I don't always know about it, but someone will be like, oh, I was at a conference and someone used your work on in their slides to talk about this issue. Or recently I was interviewed for a medical journal about dementia and the use of comics to address dementia in the medical world. So that's really rewarding to know that that's actually a teaching tool for people who are working in the industry and are actually face to face with the elderly. So yeah, and also with the book I'm doing now, 100-Year-Old Wisdom, I'm trying to kind of address aging and sort of get people more comfortable with the idea of aging and be so that we can be better at it and better at supporting the elderly, better at sort of being comfortable with the idea of aging and know what to expect and the best way to do it, and take care of our community in a more holistic way. I was pretty horrified at some of the homes that my grandma went through until she found the one she was in finally. And even then, it's like just people were so cut off from the world and have so much to give in a way still, like in many ways, but we really segregate the elderly away and don't want to face the reality of aging and kind of throw people away. And so with my work, I'm trying to sort of bring attention to that and make us aware of our bias against aging and the elderly.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we'll talk a bit. I'd love to talk a bit more about 100-Year-Old Wisdom, because is that going to be like a graphic novel form? I've seen the Instagram. Can you tell us a bit about it, and if there's any particular bits of wisdom that you really loved you want to share?
Wow, it's been an amazing project. I went to Angoulême. So I envisioned this project where I wanted to sort of interview near 100-year-old women particularly. And then it kind of, once I started looking for interviews, I had, men, people were like, oh, I know this guy who has amazing stories. So I sort of wasn't able to like turn anyone away. I just made it, I would interview anyone who was near 100 years old. And I was really inspired by Myra Kalman's book, Principle of Uncertainty. She has this beautiful book where she's just kind of musing on different philosophical ideas and meeting people and painting in these gorgeous gouache paintings, like her surroundings. And I was really inspired by that because I love also sort of grandma houses, like granny homes, and all the like objects that people keep and collect, and the aesthetic. So I wanted to paint people in their environments and also weave together the past and learn more about the world and history through an individual perspective. And so I got a Canada Council grant to travel to the Angoulême artist residency, Maison des Auteurs in Angoulême, France, where it's really like the center of comics in Europe. They really have an incredible comics festival there every January that is massive, and they have an amazing library and residency. And so I went there and traveled I was there for 9 months the first time I was there, and I traveled to 11 different countries and interviewed like probably 30 people at that time, kind of coordinating interviews from my studio and then going out and traveling and coming back and collect and kind of transcribing and starting to make the comics as I was there. And it was really amazing it was a huge undertaking, just finding people, coordinating the travel, then like recording the interviews, transcribing them, turning them into scripts, turning them into rough thumbnails, and now I'm finally doing the artwork for it. I went back, I had like a 5-month break, and then I went to keep working on the comics, and then I went back to the residency just to kind of be there to do the comics. But that's when the pandemic hit, and I had been arranging, I had gotten a grant to go to Japan to interview people there because it's another blue zone. There are a few of these blue zones where there are higher rates of centenarians than most parts of the world. And so the reason I went to Europe was because there are these blue zones in Icaria, Greece, and Sardinia, Italy. I really wanted to go there. And then, but well, I did go to those places, but I wanted to go to Okinawa, Japan, but the pandemic hit. And I ended up doing a bunch more interviews over Zoom, just to make sure I got a really diverse a lot of diverse perspectives, and not so much focus just on Europe kind of thing. And so that was amazing, actually, because the pandemic made everybody have to use Zoom anyways, or just like video connections, and people were so extra isolated and extra wanting to connect, and it was very easy to record the interviews. And so families were very keen to help make these connections, and we, overcame certain technological barriers or whatever. And I got probably 10 or 15 more interviews from that process. And then I've been, just kind of transcribing, scripting, roughing it out. And then now I'm on the artwork part. But it's going to be a graphic novel, and Drawn and Quarterly are publishing it. Yay. They're so great. And it's going to be sort of short comics that focus on each person, sort of profiling each person, braiding together the past and the present, picking up on different themes that come up, and really situating them into their lives, how they live at the time of the interview, and then it will be all collected. And I have like an intro and an afterword that sort of talks about how I did the project and then what my findings were. And there are, it's kind of ridiculous to ask someone what their secret to long life is. People are just like, well, I get up every morning, or, you keep breathing. Like, how do you do it? It's just such a silly thing, but there were a lot of cute answers. But yeah, I did find, and I guess I'm kind of giving away the thesis of the book, but I do find that the people who live a long time are ones that have something to live for, and they are either passionate about something, or they find pleasure in something, and they just want to keep living. And it's more of like a spiritual life force, because there are a lot of different factors to health and living, and that's not necessarily the main thing, is being healthy, or having a certain kind of lifestyle. I think it's more about having something to be here for. So that was really cool to learn. And I do hope that, and I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from this book in terms of a didactic application too. So I'm very excited to share it whenever it's done. It's taken a long time.
Yeah, as it should.
How did you navigate the languages in Europe?
I hired translators, or I had the family, if they could translate for me. But yeah, I hired translators in different places.
And your grant helped cover that?
Yes. I've gotten support from Ontario Arts Council, Canada Council, and Toronto Arts Council for this project, which has been amazing.
Yeah. Congratulations. It sounds
Thank you.
Oh, I can't wait to read it. I'm so excited.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
Yeah. So we're going to open up for questions in a moment, but before we did, Susan, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about another project you work on called Visualizing End-of-Life Issues.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm a graphic recorder as well, which is, someone who stands up in meetings and draws what's going on in words and pictures in real time. And a group of graphic reporters really across the world, but mostly in the States. There are a couple of Canadians, led by a woman named Jill Greenbaum, decided we wanted to explore how visuals might be of assistance in helping people come to terms with the fact we all die. And so we have been meeting for 2 years now on Zoom because of the pandemic. And we've been mostly, it's a very loose group, and we've been mostly doing research, and we have invited people to come, and we practice doing their end of life vigil. So we ask them to pretend that they're dying within the next few days, and under what circumstances do they want to be? Who do they want there? Where do they want to be? What kind of pain control do they want to be? And so people have volunteered, my friends have volunteered to do that. And what we're finding is people are afraid to do this, but once they get started, it really comes because it's more of the soft stuff. It's more about reflecting on how they want their life to kind of surface at the end, what they've done their whole time, but also what they're finding it as very valuable as a tool to open the conversation with younger family members, because it's a very difficult conversation, but the visuals are very friendly and inviting. And so they are able to bring it up with less dread with younger members of the family, because it should be a discussion we all have at some point, because no one knows when they're going to die and what are your wishes. Yeah, so that's been,
Wow.
it's just percolating in the background, but I am having a meeting next week with the executive director of Hospice Halifax, and I'm wondering, and perhaps I'm just jinxing it by saying it, but I'm wondering if there's some possibility for a cartoonist in residence at Hospice Halifax to explore the end of life. And I say that because last summer they put out a call for someone quickly, because a resident who was dying wanted a cartoon. And this woman had a very humorous, she found herself in hospice always on the bedpan. And she thought this was hilarious. So she wanted to do a cartoon about how she makes all her last calls on the bedpan. And anyway, she was just a delightful woman. And so I did this cartoon for her. And then she died, and it was such a surprise. I just, where did I think I was? I don't know, but she was just so full of life. And so that got me thinking there may be some value. I don't know. I want to know if Hospice Halifax thinks there's some value, because cartoons are very, very powerful. And you can express so much in, the line can do anything. It can take you into the past and future, and it can make the present so much more exuberant or full of life than it really is. Or I don't know. So I don't know what Hospice Halifax goals might be, but I know that their principle, their sort of central principle is compassion. And that's another thing I want to explore, is why is there so little compassion in healthcare delivery in the system? And I've already started a cartoon about that. I just came back from Banff, and I started a 6-page cartoon on that. So yeah.
Oh, that's so exciting. No, and I think it's wonderful that you're both, this is your practice, and that there's such potential for connecting with people at the end of their life, and for the people who are left behind. I think you're doing very excellent work. So thank you. And thank you for joining me today. I'm gonna open it up for questions just before we sign off for the day, if that's okay with you guys. And if people are shy, we can chat, the three of us can chat more. But if anybody has any questions for Susan and Rebecca, you can pop in the chat or turn your video on and ask away. The floor is yours.
Hello.
Hi, come on in.
I was wondering, and Rebecca, you kind of touched on this a bit earlier, how you don't go into comics thinking there's going to be a truckload of money pulling up to your house, probably. But I'm wondering if either of you have seen any glimmers of the audience growing. I get even thinking of Kate Beaton's book, Ducks winning Canada Reads. And does it seem like an audience that is growing, or that the potential to to have this be a more viable financial endeavor? Is that something that's changing?
Go
I
ahead,
could say
Susan.
that generally books do not make money, whether they're graphic or otherwise. The challenge for me was that my reader was going to be a middle-aged or older woman. And I did see some research where that audience is growing, but right now they don't tend to, it's mostly still the young men and the Marvel comic kind of thing where the money is, I think. But that's, people have come up and say, you're the first graphic memoir I've ever read or graphic narrative I've ever read, and I plan to read more. So I think it's kind of book by book, but you're right, there's absolutely no money. If I made $2,000, I don't even think I made that. Anyway, that was it. And I went into a second printing, so.
I think that going to the Center for Cartoon Studies was really good for industry connections. I met people who were working for like HarperCollins and like for Second and other bigger publishers. And I think you can get bigger advances, mostly in the young adult graphic novel world. There is a growing industry there, and that's kind of the golden ticket, is to kind of get in. Like if you can be published by Scholastic, I mean, I think that'd be pretty great. Also getting your stuff optioned for film and TV, that's where the money is. But other things like going to Angoulême and seeing the comics industry there, I don't think that those artists are really like making bank necessarily, but that society is more supportive towards artists. There's a lot more subsidies and also more of an audience. And I think that we in North America are kind of catching up with that sort of the culture of comics and graphic novels, where we've lost a lot because of especially particularly in the 50s when comics were looked at as being bad for children, and the Comics Code came in, and a lot of artists were stifled and made to be ashamed of being cartoonists. I think we're still dealing with that cultural repression here, and it was such an exciting it was so exciting to go to France and see how celebrated comics are. It's a bigger industry than the car industry. It's like a massive, the whole city was tents full of books and all new releases. It was incredible. People really buy books. They really look at it as a high art form. They're not, of course, like they will not have censorship. We see that they're so diehard about it with like Charlie Hebdo, and even at the festival where there were school groups, there would be these curtains with red curtains where the like kind of scandalous, like sexy comics were behind these curtains, but that was on display. Like everything was on display, and everything was accepted, and but there's a standard, but it's celebrated and appreciated. And I think that we are slowly working out our way towards a more accepting culture of comics here. The Toronto Comics Arts Festival was off the hook this year. Like there are so many appreciators out there. I think it's just like slow changes, and I think the economy is not looking great in general. People don't have a lot of extra cash to buy expensive graphic novels. It really is a labor of love, but I do think that there are ways, especially since we have grants, and I think there are ways to kind of position yourself to succeed by doing stuff that's more marketable and more potential for getting grants, and also if you can get to Angoulême and try to sell your book to an international publisher and get it translated, and then you have a much wider audience to sell to. So, you know, I think it's like you got to work hard and be smart, but getting yourself in those places and connected with industry people, and yeah, that's, I think, a good way to go.
Most definitely. Do we want to have maybe one quick question before we go? If anybody else has any questions? Okay.
I don't want to monopolize things.
Go ahead.
And this isn't really a question, I guess, but more as you were both speaking, and I think the idea, it kind of occurred to me that, yeah, I think there is an avoidance a lot of the time with facing death, understandably. And even when it's someone that you love and care about, and it can be hard to face that, and to face their death and to face your own death. And it really hit me as you were both talking how much both of you are overcoming that to immerse yourself into places where that is going to be a reality, like a short-term reality. And that I'm sure a lot of the people you've worked with and are talking with, and you've already mentioned some of the people that you've both interviewed or talking with, and they've passed on. And I guess I just wanted to acknowledge that intense kind of emotion that you've both taken on, to be able to know that you're going to be dealing with that. Like if you're talking to people who are almost 100 years old, people in nursing homes, people who are nearing the end of life. I don't know. Has that been difficult? I know it's been difficult, but are there ways that you've been able to overcome that weight?
I feel cheering up just hearing you speak. So yeah, it is difficult. But for me, I've always drawn since I could hold a pencil. And so having to enter this very difficult situation of nursing home care, drawing, first of all, I just drew the residents, and that helped me. And then I've always been my career was always in public relations. So I've always been a communicator. And then I just realized those two could go together to help me heal and to bring awareness to this to this thing that we all hide from. So yeah, it's been hard, but it's been helpful for sure.
It's kind of cathartic. It's like hard to sit with these feelings without being able to do something about it. And I think, seeing my grandma go through that, that pain was what kind of pushed me to do something about it and to try to capture it in this way. And that's what, it's like these graphic novels are such a long process, no matter what way you go about it. And you have to be, committed. It has to be something you really care about, or else you won't finish it. And I think the fact that the stakes are so high, or that it's so emotionally resonant to me, that's what kind of keeps me going, knowing that these families would appreciate so much their grandparents' stories being documented, or that people could take this wisdom and incorporate it into their lives, and that would make a difference to them. So that the fact that it's sort of high emotion, and that actually is what pushes me forward to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. There's a passion. There's a fire in my belly, or there was, and there certainly is around the projects that I'm just starting now. And therapy, that helped a lot too.
Also, I wanted to bring up this kind of anecdote that when I was at NASCAD, my first year in this studio overview class, we had to make a comic, and I'd never made a comic before. And I did it about this incident in my life where I was going to a family dinner, and I sat on the sponge cake my mom had made for Passover, and it was so embarrassing. It was something I hid in the closet all dinner because I was so embarrassed. And for many years, it was this story that brought me a lot of shame. And then making the comic about it totally transformed that experience. And it was, you know, it was, instead of being this embarrassing thing, it was like this funny comic I made that I owned the storyline to, or whatever. And it totally changed the way I looked at that experience after that. And I realized how, you know, powerful it is to make art about hard things. So, you know, the stuff I make art about is usually hard things, and I'm trying to make it better for myself and for other people who read it.
Yeah, I totally agree. There was a lot, I held a lot of shame because I blamed myself for the conflict I had with my brother, and certainly looking that right in the face and really understanding more rationally the part I played and the part I didn't play, and I didn't have to beat myself up so much. So yeah, dealing with shame, I think, through comics is really powerful. And I just want to say, I'd love to have a Halifax comic community, and I don't know why we aren't having a comic residency here in beautiful Nova Scotia. There's certainly places, and I don't know. I just, like I say, I was telling, I'll just wrap this up quickly, but I was telling Molly and Rebecca that I just came back from the Banff graphic novel and visual narrative residency, and the mentors were American, and how come? You know, so yeah, we can do it. I don't know why we can't do something here. That's what I say. Not that I really want a whole big project. I had that too. But
Yeah, we got great comic makers in Nova Scotia. We got
Oh,
like a
for
couple of them in
sure.
the chat, you know, a couple of them in the talk today for sure.
host the graphic medicine conference here. I've been beating that drum for years because
Yeah.
we have the School of Nursing, we have NASCAD, we have a med school, we have medical humanities at Dow. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like we've got lots of work to do still, you know, lots of projects on the go. Well, thank you guys so much for chatting with me today. It was such a treat. For anyone interested in seeing more from Rebecca and Susan, I've popped both of their links to their websites in the chat in kind of different places. You can read more about them and read their books, buy their books, maybe. Check it out. I've read both of them this week and highly recommend. And if you're interested in these artwork talks, we've got another one coming up next month on June 20th. We've got Translating Mediums with Cal Lane and Julie Rosewall. And yeah, thank you guys again so much for coming today.